Well, here we are.
Here we are.
I believe we're live, everyone, and this is cool. This is something that's a little bit new for us, and uh, this is going to be good. I'm sitting with Dr. Van, and we are going to have a chat about the Lord of the Kings.
Yeah, absolutely.
And so let's start off. Just get everyone on the same page. What we're talking about. We are talking about a series that we're in right now as Agincourt Church. Throughout the summer, looking at the books of Luke and Acts, which are kind of volume 1, volume 2, written
Right.
by the same author.
Right.
And you have some intimate knowledge with these books. These are some favorites for you. Some
Sure are.
some.
Right. I do because of my biblical studies background and my Pentecostal studies background. In biblical studies today, more and more you hear the term Luke Acts because finally we've come around to realizing that when they formed the canon and they put the Gospel of John in between Volume 1 and Volume 2, they would affect the perception of those two books. They would affect the reading of those two books for the rest of church history. And we're trying to go retro here and go back to how the early church would have heard it before Luke and Acts end up in a printed collection, right?
Right. Yeah.
So Luke writes his gospel. That's volume 1. And only Luke tells us where it goes from there. So in this series, Lord of the Kings, we are looking at how volume 1 sets up volume 2. And let me just say what the significance of reading them together is by talking about what reading apart did that was, I think, disadvantageous to the reading of the church.
Okay.
If you start with the book of Acts, you might think that's where the church is beginning. This is common. Often the Acts 2 event, Spirit comes down, is seen as the beginning of the church. But if you've been tracking through the Gospels and you've seen Jesus calling followers and they're following him, and these followers are actually being sent out on missions, boy, that's starting to look a lot like the church to the one who's reading Luke. But if you think that John needs to sit in the middle and you forget what you've just seen, and then Acts becomes a whole new section in and of itself, you might think this is when the church begins. I think Peter would have been shocked to think that the church didn't start until the day of Pentecost. The other thing that I'm very sensitive as a Pentecostal about is that if you start reading about the Spirit only in the book of Acts, which many Pentecostals have, because we were told just go there.
Right.
You might miss the consistency of how the Spirit worked in Jesus and how he worked in the disciples. And we then, as modern readers, might miss this primary notion that as the Spirit enabled Jesus to proclaim, the Spirit enables the 120, the 3,000 that were added within a chapter or two at the beginning of Acts and on into our era, that the Spirit is enabling proclamation. In other words, the gift of the Spirit is a gift of communication. So important to hear the two together, and obviously that's what Luke anticipated, that you'd hear his gospel and then you would hear his next part.
That's awesome. So obviously, we really want you to collaborate with us in this moment, and
Yep.
that's why we're doing this live
Right,
as opposed
sure.
to pre-taped.
And
So-
since we are talking about the end of death particularly, it is good that we're doing this live.
Hey,
Right,
I'll,
right.
I'll live.
Yeah, that's
And
right.
so if we could encourage you to collaborate with us, if you're not on any kind of social media platform, we would get you to search for us at Agincourt Church. Just anyway, you can type Agincourt Church, and you'll find us there. And if you've been tracking with this series, you've been maybe doing the reading plan with us, and we've had some
Right.
great conversations, especially on Twitter,
Good.
with a number of people who've been sharing their thoughts that they've been reading. And we just moved to Acts this week.
Okay,
This week's
okay,
reading
great.
was starting in Acts,
Yeah, good.
and it's been really cool. I've been blown away by some of the thoughts and ideas that have been coming out, and they've been really fresh. It's kind of like you're doing your devotions with other people. You
There
know,
you
it's really, really special.
There you go.
And it's a very community driven thing. So anyway, we've
Yep.
loved that. So we would encourage you to do that. Now the hashtag we're using for today, as well as the plan, is hashtag LOTK for Lord of the Kings, LOTK plan. So you can contribute to that right now and ask us questions. But one of the things that we wanted to do particularly this week is coming out of your teaching. We are fascinated with death because
Sure.
there's, as a culture, as humans, and we always have been, because there's so much uncertainty around it, and there's, as you use the post, and crossing past that post this week was your example of what it means to cross from life to death, and so many of us are I'd say worried is a nice way to put it.
Scared to death.
Yeah, scared to death of what happens when we cross there. So
Yeah,
why don't you unpack some of the teaching,
Sure.
just review some of it, especially for those who are a little forgetful like myself or who weren't there this weekend.
Yep.
And even as he's talking, we would encourage you to
Yeah,
start participating
absolutely.
with the conversation.
Okay, good. So what we did was we're looking at the theme of life, but particularly death in Luke Acts. And to do that, we needed to set up the background that Luke was using, the Genesis narrative, the Old Testament narrative. Because Luke isn't writing in a vacuum. He's working from the context of the Old Testament. So we went back to the first 3 chapters of Genesis and did a short history of life and death and made this simple point, that Adam and Eve started to die long before they actually died. Death being more spiritual than it is physical. So the account of Adam and Eve taking the fruit of the one tree that they were not supposed to take part of meant that when God came looking for them after that event, they moved away from God. They separated themselves. They hid themselves. And then God furthers it by banishing them from the garden. And then the eventual result of all this then is physical death. But the key for us to try to understand life and death is that it's always more spiritual than physical, and we focus on the physical.
Right.
In other words, the key moment is now, today, what choices we're making, not then. So Adam and Eve make a decision, and they begin to separate themselves. So very simply, what we said on Sunday morning, let me say in this little recap here. Biblically speaking, life is relationship with God. Since God's the author of life, everything significant is happening in connection with Him. Death is separation from God. You can be separate from God now and be dying inside, and physical death just sort of ends the process, right? So we want to change our view away from what is frightening about physical death and consider how serious it is, the decisions we're making about life and death now, because it's more spiritual than physical. Luke Acts shows us what happens to death when Jesus arrives, when, as the Lord of the Kings arrives, all of a sudden you're starting to see in a short period of time, Jesus keeps bringing people back from beyond the pole, the other side of death, keeps bringing them back. Not without precedent in the Old Testament, but it's the number of times that Jesus is doing this. So we took from the floor on Sunday night, or Saturday night, Lazarus came back. The widow's son comes back in Luke 7. And then Jairus' 12-year-old daughter comes back. Why is Jesus doing all this since they all died eventually? Right?
Yeah.
So what you're seeing here is the beginning of the end of death. Jesus has come to restore what was lost in the garden. And what you're seeing now is very clearly that death just doesn't have the power it once had to hold people in, to keep
Right.
them in. They're crossing, right? Now they would all cross back, but that was just the beginning. The focal point of Sunday, Saturday, was where those of you who are at the reading plan right now are. Luke Acts, the hinge. The cross deals with the spiritual nature of sin as separation. The resurrection deals with the physical aspect of death. So what you're seeing with Jesus' death is dealing with the sin issue, which caused the separation in the first place, reversing Adam's disobedience, right? Jesus is obedient, dies in our place, so removes the sin barrier, and then you see by the fact that he is raised from the dead, even the physical barrier now is gone. And this gives us a preview for the great Christian hope that God's not going to leave us here, that God's not going to leave us in the grave, that what happened to Jesus happens to us. But the key is the spiritual dimension, right?
Well, okay, so a couple things. Want to continue to encourage you to ask your questions. If you want to text a question, 416-291-9575 is our church number. I'm monitoring our number right now. So 416-291-9575, and you can ask a question that way. But you may be thinking the last 3 minutes of what Dr. Van unpacked was very rich in some of the significance of what he said. It might be worth going back and watching the teaching again, or it's great that we're actually capturing this. You can watch it again because
Right. Okay.
there's some significance in that. But let's jump into some of the questions we got, and we'll see where the conversation takes us. Some of the ones that we got on the weekend,
Yeah.
and even some of the ones we're starting to get are so much about what about these stories in the Bible where people came back to life?
Yeah. Sure. Of course.
And they kind of they only tell us what's helpful to the narrative in the moment, but our minds immediately are, so what happened to them? So one question we got here, let me just pull it up, is what are your thoughts around the individuals who return back to life after crossing over into death? Is there reference to how they went about life afterwards?
Right. Yeah. No. So what's really interesting here is where we do get insight into what the future looks like. It's not with the dead who came back for a brief point of time, because as you said, and you said it well, the miracle narratives of Jesus are to the point that Jesus did this. It's a focus on what he's doing, not so much the experience of the individual and what life was like for them the next day. We can only imagine, right? Not your average day when you're brought back to life, okay? So you mark that down as, oh, I remember that day. Absolutely. But what you do see is those who are living being given a vision or a dream sequence, including the one time I was able to get you into class, Book of Revelation.
Yeah, right.
The Book of Revelation.
Yeah.
And so what you see is exactly the opposite to what you might think. When we do get insight into what's in the beyond, it comes from those who are alive, who are spiritually connected, getting an insight and a vision of what the future looks like. But even that is not as clear as we might like it. But here is the common point. I didn't bring this out all on Sunday. This is an exclusive for the Tuesday Noon at Live. Tuesday News at Live.
There you go.
Is this, that hell, we haven't talked about it because it really wasn't in our wheelhouse for this weekend. Hell is essentially beyond any furniture we imagine there, temperature gauge we imagine in there. Hell is essentially the place where God is not. So if spiritual death right now is separation, this is complete separation after death. And so what makes hell so hellish, the reason we don't want to be there is that there's none of the experienced life of God that makes life beautiful. There's just everything that is what we would not want. That's what makes hell hell. So the connection is in all the visions that you see wonderful things when you see heaven, awful things when you see hell. But don't get too worried about reading the various parables of Jesus or even the Book of Revelation and trying to imagine it too literally.
Right.
Just notice the point is, this is a horrible place because none of God's redeeming presence is here. This is a wonderful place because this actually is where God is. The question's really good. And of course, I think part of the reason we're curious is every once in a while there's a book written or a movie shot.
Right, yeah.
Right? About somebody who was, for a period of time, declared dead and has some visionary experiences. Okay, I'm not against those. I don't know what to do with them. But I'm not against them because the physical death is not the main event. And so that there's some kind of conscious existence. You're not going to get me arguing with that. But here's the problem with, here is where we should be careful whenever we read an account of what somebody experienced. We want to be careful not to imagine that at the point of death, somebody is fully experiencing the future. And I'll say it just for one primary reason, is that the full participation in the future is a future event even for everybody who has passed on. there is a day coming called the day of judgment.
Right.
And that's the point at which we will see the future clearly. That's where heaven becomes clear. That's where hell becomes real. And what you have in this, we're all asking questions about the interim, and that's good. But let's just keep in mind that the whole idea of a resurrection body, Jesus comes back resurrected. The whole idea of a resurrection body is that we're now fit for a different type of existence. We're asking, what will I experience as soon as I die? What about that, young man who said he came back? Okay, cool. So I'm happy with visionary experiences, but this is not his full experience of the afterlife, because that is yet to come. So it's this interim experience we're interested in. And obviously when Paul says, Philippians 1, to be absent from the body, present with the Lord, he has some idea of, some consciousness of God's presence. But the great hope for Paul and the church, and for many of you watching now, is not what happens immediately after we die, but that great day that is coming. And sometimes we get confused.
Right.
And we think the main event is actually the preliminary event, right?
Right. And that's like two answers in one. Like hell is a whole big question, like you talked about first.
Yep.
And thanks for clarifying that, because I think we have so many images and pictures about it that we misunderstand it. But then also answering a little more directly, what happened to those people. Okay, so another question that we have, and I want to jump off on it a little bit.
Okay.
What we have in the accounts in the Gospels, when Jesus dies, the tombs are opened for a number of people, and there was people walking around that were dead for a while. So I'm totally curious about that. I don't know what there is to make of it, other than the significant supernatural event that was occurring.
Thanks for answering that. Absolutely. Is this actually your own question?
Yeah, well,
Okay.
I'm jumping off on it.
That's the mystery. We don't
Yeah.
know really what's behind the screen.
Yeah.
That's right. And it's only in Matthew. What Matthew is trying to say, his contribution to this whole thing is, this was such a dramatic moment that you even see the realm of the dead getting shaken again. So, as Jesus is raising individuals in sequence, not all the time. Jesus' ministry wasn't in the sick wards of the day, or he wasn't roaming the cemeteries, but he's doing it enough just to show that something's happening here, because he's the Lord. And I think this is Matthew's way. Very little explanation in Matthew. Students ask me about all the time, and I think all we can take from it is again, this death and resurrection of Jesus is such a world-shaking event that it actually shakes the spiritual world. And again, in reaction to that, there are some coming back, but by all accounts, they're not alive today. We can't Skype them in. I mean, it'd be fascinating if we got a question from somebody who was back
if you're out there,
you will be screened.
We'd
We're just
love
telling you, if you try it, you will be screened. Don't try that with me. Okay? Try that with Pastor Keith Smith. Don't try that one.
There you go.
That one with me. But again, I think that is the point. As much as we want details, that's Matthew's way of saying, here we go again. Death has just lost something, and here's another preview of it, but not the final event.
Well, that's awesome. Just we're still open for questions. I want to make another invitation. If you're out there and thinking about it, even if this is past the event, feel free to contribute to the conversation. We're using the hashtag LOTK plan, which is Lord of the Kings plan, and that's a reading plan that we're using as a church. And also, you can just search for Agincourt Church on any social media platform, and if we're there, you'll find us pretty quick. And I'm trying to monitor them right now. So
yeah, you're doing a great job. Do we have a moment just to talk about this coming Sunday?
Why don't we talk about this Sunday?
Okay. And Saturday night, of course. You don't want to forget that we do have services on Saturday night, now at 5:30.
That's right.
Right?
Yep.
Okay, so we're going to continue this on. And those of you who are been reading through Luke, I hope you noticed, and please reflect back between now and Saturday, Sunday, on the significance of the table scenes in the Gospel of Luke. The table represents the kingdom. And so there's all kinds of questions related to the various table scenes. Are you thinking of some now? Will you think of some between now and Saturday night, Sunday morning? Because again, as I did, asking about what scenes you remember where Jesus brought somebody back from the dead, I'll want to do that again Saturday night, Sunday. Tell me about various scenes where there's a meal. And so start thinking with me, what is Luke doing by showing you so many table scenes? Well, what he's doing is he's using the table as a symbol of the kingdom. And the inevitable question, who gets to sit there and who doesn't? Who's serving the table and who's actually enjoying the meal? So the table is this repeated metaphor in Luke that sets up the book of Acts, where the table represents the kingdom itself. And of course, many of you who are actually taking the time to watch this would be very familiar with the phrase, the marriage supper of the Lamb. And there you have this idea that there's going to be this great banquet up there again, right?
Yeah.
So tables now in light of that great table there. So the idea of who you eat with had a little different significance in the first century than it does today, though maybe not as much as I might have thought when I first began to think about the whole thing. There's still some similarities the way we treat tables and who we invite, but it was a little different back then, and so that's what we'll be looking at this Saturday and Sunday, the significance of the table scenes.
Awesome. Okay, so while we're in a bit of a lull in between questions, but I'm believing we'll have some more, so contribute. Why don't you share with us just a little bit about where you're headed this fall and some of the opportunities? I know there's always opportunities. If this conversation is interesting to you, what is an opportunity maybe for someone who has an interest level that would push them maybe to even consider a course, or what are some of the best next steps for them in terms of engaging with our seminary and maybe sitting in a classroom with you?
Matt, this is a surprise question. This is a great question. Yeah, thanks. All the time I will get individuals saying, what should I read? What should I do more? Every once in a while, one of those individuals will jump right in and say, I'd like to sit in a structured class. And so, absolutely. Seminary, what I teach is graduate level. So, strictly speaking, you need a college degree, undergrad degree, sciences, behavior management, right? Even a BTH, Bachelor of Theology in Bible to qualify. And then you walk into a seminary classroom, and you could sit and take a class with me. We're live streaming one in the fall. I'll tell you about it in a moment. And then we've got some more classroom-based ones, the traditional ones. Tell you about that in the moment. I've got two in particular I got in mind. But just let me say to you that you have an option. You can take it just as an audit student. So it still costs you a bit of money. Our partner is Tyndale, and we've agreed to honor their pricing system. We're not going to try to undercut them, get in their system, be partners, and then offer it, take it with me for 50% less, right?
Yeah.
So there's a pricing system. Maybe, it's a few $100s, I think, to take it for audit. But a lot of students do that. I have a pastor who's taken my entire program almost took it by auditing it all, and just wants it for personal benefit. So you can audit any class, but still you're supposed to qualify for it by having some kind of degree. Every once in a while there'll be an exception made. But what the seminary is trying to do is just say, okay, to have the best discussions possible, let's get people who are all on something of a level playing field. They've done undergraduate studies, they've done a college degree, and put them in the room. And it's very stimulating place to be. Seminary classroom, graduate room. So 2 courses I'll tell you about, then we'll check to see if there's any other questions, and maybe we'll take 1 or 2 more. I'm teaching Luke this fall as a class. Okay, now because some of you are doing Luke Acts, I'm doing Luke as a class. Matt, I'm thinking it's late Wednesday afternoons.
Okay.
But it would be the 12-week variety. At Tyndale, we use their facilities. Bayview between Finch and Steeles. That would be wonderful. You could just sit in there, and there'll be 20 to 25, and we take Luke as a story and start unpacking the narrative in a way that you're starting to see a little bit of as you're doing the reading plan. But unless you're in a discussion group and being guided by it, obviously you're going to miss a lot. So, you race through it. We take it as narrative. So that's the Luke class. So that would be the most natural offshoot of this one. The other class I want to push is one that we're live streaming. So you can join me at Tyndale on 5 Fridays, every second week or so, starting the full week after Labor Day. So you can start there with us in the classroom, or you could live stream it from home, or I wanted to say the office. Probably wouldn't be, unless you're working in the church office, then of course it would be welcomed that you would take the course with me from your church office. But Intro to Pentecostalism, where we take a look at where Pentecostalism came from, where it emerged, its particular spirituality, and at the center of early Pentecostalism is this early belief that you find in the New Testament about the soon coming of Jesus. Eschatology again, right?
Yeah, okay.
So even though it's Pentecostalism, Pentecostals were formed as much by a certain eschatological belief as any group God has raised up. So if you're interested in that, 5 full Fridays, and to find information about that, probably just Google our website, MP Seminary, right? MP Seminary, www.mpseminary, Masters Pentecostal, mpseminary.com.
Cool.
Okay, our questions flooding in.
I've got one for you.
Okay.
And this is one of my own again, but
Yes.
there's so many times where we have. I think I've grown up reading the Bible a lot, trying to come at it as from a personal devotional perspective, and the older I get, the more I'm curious how I can intelligently approach the scriptures in a way where I'm reading the way the author was trying to tell me, as opposed to superimposing my perspective onto it. And so for those of us who are reading this reading plan, and we just finished Luke, we're heading into Acts. What are like 1 or 2 questions that we could be asking ourselves every day when we finish reading it that would help shift our paradigm a bit, or open up our mind a bit to what Luke was writing, and help us dig into it a bit more from his perspective?
Great. Okay, so I'm going to answer this question the best I can, and it's a passion of mine. That's why I teach seminary. But that question does not disparage the reading you and I have done through the years when we knew very little. Mm-hmm. The Spirit of God steps in and helps us. But in the ancient world, Matt, you said something very early on, and I didn't want to jump in right there because we were just getting started. But you talked about the social dynamics of reading this together. It's like you're having devotions together.
Yeah.
That was much more the early church experience because
Totally.
people didn't have Bibles. They couldn't read anyways.
Yeah.
So Bible study, devotions, was more corporate church gathering than it was ever individual. And we've gone to the other extreme. And I think it's a disadvantage to think that anybody can just read the scriptures for themselves. So we trust the Spirit, but we don't want to be stupid because one brain, one set of experiences. Mm-hmm. And the Spirit speaks through others, and that's the whole idea of the church. So we're not disparaging that reading that just says, okay, Lord, I need something today. I have no idea about the historicity of Elijah, who these Israelites were, but I need a word, right? But there is a reading of the text that has a sensitivity to the historical distance. That's what you're asking.
Yeah.
There's a historical distance between first century life and 21st century life.
Yeah.
2 millennia, and of course, the degree of social change is only becoming more rapid. So let me suggest something simple you can do, and then something a little bit more complex. The simplest thing to do whenever you read a portion of any of the Gospels, Luke in particular, is at the end of it, you say to yourself, Jesus, what did I just learn about you? The Gospels are all a form of ancient literature called, not completely unfamiliar to us, ancient biography.
Right.
The focus is Jesus. That's why you don't get the testimonies of the people who came back from the dead. The focus is on what Jesus said and did. So the best way to read the Gospels is at the end of every section say, okay, through this writing that was inspired, what has the writer told me? What did I just learn about Jesus? So that's first and foremost. But secondly, and this is what we're trying to get at in this series, and that's why I hope people will come during the civic holiday. We're going to talk about the significance of the ancient table. And so at some point, you've got to do some digging as to what ancient customs were, ancient social dynamics. Because once you catch on to that, now you're realizing the tensions. When we go to a movie theater today, there's a shared set of expectations, the way people interact. So we get the interactions.
Yeah.
Not so much in the first century, because it is a different world. The degree to which shame and honor are prized values in the ancient world drive much of the ancient narrative, but we don't get it because we live in the modern West, where it's about achievement and money and status that is conferred based on how much you've made.
Right.
So at some point you've got to dig in there a little bit, and there are a couple books, and we could put them on the website. A few books that help you understand the culture of the first century a bit more. Even a book that helps you understand the nature of eschatology at the time of Jesus. So all that really does help, but that does take a little bit more study, and that's what we're trying to get at a little bit in this series, because you're right to ask that question. Okay, how are they hearing this, right?
Right, yeah.
Like this confrontation between Jesus and the Pharisees, we're ready to jump all over it. But how is the crowd reading that? When Jesus is going after the Pharisees, are people going, preach it? Or are they standing with the Pharisees? Like, where's the social dynamic there, right? And what happens when that debate is over?
Yeah.
Like, does somebody win? Is this like a presidential kind of thing where one, right? Or do they both agree to disagree? Those dynamics are really quite different in the first century. So no easy way to answer that without some further study. But the quickest way to always do this is not so much what did I learn about the disciples, what did I learn about Jesus here? Because as ancient biography, that's the focus.
That's really good. I think that's a great question. If you believe the Bible is a narrative that leads us to Jesus and helps us understand him, then that's what we should be asking no matter when we're reading.
Yeah.
That's really good. Okay, we actually have a couple more questions, and I don't think we got them kind of late, so we got time for one more. I like this one.
Yeah, okay.
Will Dr. Van die, or will he be transported like Enoch, Elijah, and Moses?
Right, okay. Like, there's only a few that get to be transported, and thank you for the question. But my guess would be if Jesus doesn't return, somebody's singing at my memorial.
There you go. Okay.
Yeah, there you go. And please make sure, Matt, if you're in charge of it, like it's something that I would have sung and somebody holds out the last note long enough so I can get really settled into the afterlife, right? Like a really short note, I'm maybe not settled, but I want to hear that note.
Yeah. It's kind of like when I'm putting my children to sleep. Yeah.
That's right. Like just hold and then slip out.
Asleep.
That is a
asleep.
fantastic.
Not death. Sleep.
Very good. Right.
Okay. Yeah,
that's
call
very
back
good.
there. Well,
Okay. Good.
I think we're out of time for today. We'd love to hear any of your thoughts on this, and we're glad to have shared this moment with everyone who's participated in the now and in the future. If you're watching this later and you weren't able to be with us, and feel free to ask some questions. Maybe throughout the week we can bug Dr. Van to answer a couple of them if I can find him. And we'll see how that goes. But either way, join us this weekend. I think it's week 6, Lord of the Kings.
Okay, wow.
And we're talking about the table and who's at the table.
Right.
And it's going to be fantastic. But you can search for all of our social media, Agent Court Church, any of our platforms. You should be able to find us and join in on the conversation using the hashtag LOTKPlan. And if you're not already reading the reading plan with us, just message us and we can send you out some information about that. But you can jump in. It's a good time. We just got into Acts, so I know, we prefer to do them both together. That was the point of it, but
Yeah.
it doesn't mean you can't jump in
Yeah,
right now.
Right, for sure.
So thanks for being with
Great.
us. It's been really cool to try this out, and we'll see you on the
Okay.
weekend.
Yeah, see you on the weekend.
Awesome.